Daniel will begin the conversation today with some insights on the topic and then open things up for the discussion. Again, we encourage interaction, so please feel free to join the conversation. And with that, Carl, I'll hand it over to you to begin the discussion.
Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm very pleased to say we've created these Hangouts, especially for our European members and stakeholders, every Wednesday at 3 p.m. UK time and 4 p.m. Central European time for the rest of our lives. And hopefully just in time for some US attendance in their morning as they enjoy their first cup of coffee. This is our 5th European Hangout, and we do already have a planned program over the next few weeks up until the end of June on a range of topics, finance, technology, and commercial, of course, with the aim of discussing the topics concerned on an internationally wide basis. And we hope these conversations and Hangouts will help enrich everyone in this current environment. Coming up, we have topics and speakers on such areas as renegotiating your cloud contracts, SLA and SaaS contracts, 5 bets for the next 5 years and tech transformation in restaurants and hotels, and also a discussion on the cleaning standards issues that are around with us today in Europe. Now, today's topic is, and it says in my text here, very topical. Hopefully topics are topical, to say the least. We will focus on risk mapping the hotel guest experience. Our speaker today is Daniel Johnson, co-founder of Venza, who many of you may not know did graduate work in Bristol in the UK and is currently based in The Hague in Netherlands. Daniel has been part of High-Tech Europe since the very first one in Amsterdam in 2017, so I can honestly say he is truly international. Daniel, over to you.
Great, thank you, Carl. So indeed, I love to make this a conversation. I've got some prepared things to share. I'm sharing my screen now. You should be able to see it, hopefully. But eager to make this a group chat. Can you see my screen? It has a title of the.
No, we can just see Daniel Johnson. Venza has started screen sharing. That's all we can see. There, oh, there you go.
There it is.
All right. So I've got a little prezi that I've put together, and you know, got some things that I've prepared, and then we can talk at any time. So it was pretty casual. So yeah, this is going to be a little bit of walk down memory lane. I think this first part for some of you on the call, on the topic of crises and risk mapping. I know that many of you know that I have been kind of intimately involved in privacy regulations, as you perhaps saw right there by my signature. I was a member of the task force for the GDPR, task force for HFTP, and the co-chair of the global privacy regulations workforce for HTNG. So it's a passion of mine. And in conversations with Carl, I thought, you know, and a lot of these conversations we've been having throughout the industry, there seemed to be kind of an uncanny mirroring of challenges. And so brought it up to Carl, we had a conversation about it, and he said, well, it'd be good for a Hangout to explore this further. So that's where we're at today. Just looking back at the quote unquote crisis, a recent crisis with these new privacy regulations, it might seem a little quaint to think about that in comparison to the crisis that we're in today, but bear with me. I think you might see that there's some overlap. So this is just a look at, you know, when HFTP was talking about the DPO task force, the GDPR task force, and here's a look at a press release. Look at the language within that press release. You know, you see that there's a lot of immediacy, a real concern that this will bring the industry to a screeching halt. As part of that, being part of many of those conversations, there were a lot of very learned people within the industry who were saying, we can't comply to this and still be in business, and it's going to bring us to a very, very immediate halt. And how do we find a DPO? There's estimation, and you saw in this from back in, what is the date there? It shows the 8th month, August of 2017. The estimate that some 28,000 DPOs would be needed around the globe, and in order to accommodate the need for DPOs. So there was some serious hand wringing. I know may seem a little quaint in comparison to today's crisis, but it was a big concern. I'm doing this for a reason, I promise you. This is not just nostalgia. And so it is the HFTP. Carl, in particular, assembled people from throughout the world to represent and explore this issue. Some of the people on the call today are listed, and I've highlighted or underlined four specific individuals because a subcommittee was created, and that pertains to our conversation that I have moving forward. Still walking down memory lane, just wanted to outline the tasks of that task force. Set out to identify the major challenges for the industry to achieve compliance. Second bullet point, provide guidelines to enable the industry to assess their specific needs to achieve compliance. 3, define the features of a DPO. 4, establish a communication policy to create awareness. Okay, so there's a lot of things that were asked of that task force. And from the way I remember it, there were 3 particular kind of areas of vexing questions, if you will, with which we wrestled. One was around who is to lead this? Who is to take care of this? Who is to address this? Is it an IT problem? Is it a legal problem? Maybe it's operations. Is it everybody? Marketing? And then the second bullet point, another vexing question or pair of questions is, to whom does this law apply? What is a territorial jurisdiction? I would say that's still kind of, people are wrestling with that question around privacy laws. And the third one, what are the ramifications for non-compliance? What are the liabilities? Okay, so you'll see that I've got in orange there 3 words. Well, the first one is about accountability. Really, who's accountable for this? The other 2 are much larger. There's a reason that I wanted to point those out, because those 2 questions really are an indication, are the 2 primary factors when looking at risk mapping. What is the probability of the issue? And what is the impact of not solving against that with whatever that issue, whatever that risk is? So what is the probability of the risk, and what's the impact of the risk? Any risk mapping activity requires looking at those two components. And so when I look in hindsight back at our we were challenged with GDPR for the industry, it occurred to me recently, and this is based on the conversation I had really recently with Carl, that wow, we're really doing a risk mapping exercise and maybe didn't even actually know it, or maybe it was known but it wasn't verbalized in my mind or to me. So anyone that's done any risk mapping knows that risk mapping is informed in your business continuity plan, and your business continuity plan is informed by your risk mapping. A business continuity plan that hasn't done a risk mapping activity is really is no business continuity plan at all. You need to have it. A risk mapping activity that isn't informing a business continuity plan is just an exercise in futility. It needs to inform something that you can make a decision moving forward. So they go hand in glove. So the basics, for those of you that have ever assembled a business continuity plan, I had a call with Mark, who's on the call today, from High Point, being in Florida. Business continuity, in the wake of frequently having to worry about tropical storms, etc. Having a business continuity plan is just par for the course in that part of the world. But some organizations may be a little less robust in their business continuity planning. I think the COVID-19 crisis is making many of us, perhaps all of us, take a hard look at our business continuity planning. And there are six steps. The first three steps: identify your scope, identify key business areas impacted by risk, something that would impact your ability to continue business. Identify critical functions impacted, and then the last three, okay, so 4 through 6, identify dependencies between various business areas and functions, determine acceptable risk for each critical function, and create a plan to maintain operations. So that's what you got to have in your business continuity plan. That's business continuity planning 101. Very basic. So when I look back at the days of the GDPR task force, and I think about that subcommittee that was formed with to look at what we were tasked to do is to do a graphical impact demonstration diagram, if you will, of what the law would imply, how it would impact hotels. So we took to that task, and when I look in hindsight, what we came up with really addressed those first 4 components. So what we ended up able to do is identify the scope, or at least a window of the scope of GDPR to hospitality, key business areas impacted, some of the functions that are impacted, and we were able to demonstrate or diagram or illustrate, if you will, dependencies between various business functions. So what resulted from our little subcommittee that was then adopted by the larger, perfected really, by the larger task force were data flow models. Many of you that are fans of HFTP have probably seen this diagram. And essentially what it does is that you see that little blue data subject there. That person is moving from left to right, and their data is being shared. And what we hoped to illustrate with this data flow is to indicate that data is important data, and it's touching a number of different systems, and those systems are providing organizations the ability to complete various business processes. And there's liability along the way. There's risk along the way with each one. And so you need to be mindful of those relationships, those agreements along the way. So spent a lot of time talking about GDPR. Now, one of the things that we looked at all those systems. And one of the things that is what we found was that a bit of a rabbit hole was getting caught up on the systems themselves. And we had to learn how to be a little bit more disciplined in thinking about the processes, because that's what's really indicating your risk. So I want to just for a moment say, what if the task of the GDPR work task force had not been around GDPR, but around the reopening of hospitality? So these are the beginnings of those bullet points, but I've altered the end. Identify major challenges for the industry to achieve a safe return. Provide guidelines to enable the industry to assess their specific needs to achieve a safe return. And define the specific features of a safe return, and establish a communication policy to create a safe return. If we were to think in those terms, that those are the tasks of a COVID-19 task force, then what I'm indicating is that, well, if this is a crisis like the crisis before, perhaps we should venture out into utilizing the same kind of methodical approach to solve for that, which is risk mapping. Again, if we were just make a twist on those vexing questions with which we were wrestling today, are what laws and what guidelines apply? Who is best to lead this? Who is involved, or who should be? and what are the ramifications? What are our liabilities? So in the question of guidelines, one of the things that I'll be referencing in the rest of the last few slides here is there seems to be an ongoing thirst for some kind of reference, some kind of guideline. And so much of what I've presented today, I have ready for you today is I'm utilizing the WHO's accommodation sector guidelines. And interestingly enough, right straight away on page 1 there is they're talking about the very first thing that any organization in the accommodation sector should do is they ought to create an action plan. So what I want to show you now is a few steps. I've got nine different steps that I think are relevant, and then that will be it in terms of my prepared topic. But I believe that what I'm presenting here is, I think that the very first thing that organizations ought to do is do a process registry, just exactly as the very first step in doing privacy regulation compliance. A process registry is what ought to happen for the reopening. So organizations should ask, have they identified and described their business processes? Have you analyzed and identified threats and vulnerabilities? Now, what you see in those graphics, this is from, I'm part of the HT&G work group on reopening. It's got a longer name, but that's essentially what our work group is about, is to help provide guidance on the thing. And the co-chairs, Jeffrey Parker in particular, who's been leading them, his go-to approach was to do a guest journey or guest vendor staff journey. And this absolutely resonated with me, because I truly believe that is the best place to start, identifying those steps along the way. And that is precisely the idea of behind risk mapping, an end-to-end journey for the guests. And then assessments completed and documentation. That is the next step in the guest mapping or risk mapping for hospitality. And in particular, like if you look at a process like the guest arrival, you need to break it down. What's happening at the arrival of the hotel, upon entry, navigation of the lobby. This is the kind of thinking and the kind of organization of a mapping exercise that needs to be done. Now, what I asked here is, did you get stuck on solutions? And my suggestion is to not do it. Don't get stuck on the solutions, because that is the final step before getting to the processes. And you cannot determine risk if you're looking at your solutions. You have to assess your risk by looking at your processes. And what I've seen in many of these conversations is a lot of organizations looking to specific tools, technologies. Just before this call, I was on yet another HT&G call, and the conversation was around contact tracing. I've been on calls we were talking about with a customer in the Caribbean, and they were all about taking temperatures of guests and installing expensive technological solutions. Now, I love technology. Clearly, I love technology. But the question is, if we get hung up on the solutions and identifying what solutions provide us what benefit, we will never be able to adequately assess our risk. And only once we are able to do a proper risk mapping and determine determine risk, can we make informed decisions on what is right and what is wrong for an organization? Many hoteliers are talking about complete contactless door mechanisms, swapping out every lock in a 150 room hotel. Is that the best approach? Will that provide you the greatest amount of liability reduction? Is that where the highest risk is? Focusing on a solution does not help you understand your risk. You need to go all the way and understand your process. If you got nothing from my prepared remarks, hopefully that would be it, because that to me is that is where we saw the greatest amount of distraction with regards to privacy regulation, and I think it certainly applies here. Assigning roles is really important in a risk mapping. When you're looking and identifying who is involved with the organization, at the organization at that very step, for example, arriving at the hotel, who is accountable for that step along the way? That should be essential to your inventorying. The next one, process risk assessed and cessation of unsafe processing documented. Make sure that if you have if there's an impact, there's a risk that you have identified because you went and looked at the process, that if it is providing you risk, that you have eliminated it, and documented that you have eliminated it. For example, logbook of actions is listed in the WHO's outline of guidelines for the accommodation sector. It should be a part of your plan. Coordinate associates appropriately as step 5. So the question is, have you organized your team? Have you conducted segmentation? Are you contact tracing of your team? And when I mean segmentation, are you identifying that certain individuals are able to access only certain floors of the hotel? If so, if that's a process, it needs to be documented, okay? Interestingly enough, for example, in the WHO, reception desk staff, if possible, should not be older or with underlying health conditions. Is that part of your HR plan? Has that been outlined? This is something that you need to document. Step 6, communication. Have you defined and published hygiene-related policies? Have they been shared with your team? Have they been trained? Communication as a big part of the WHO's guidelines. Have you documented your hygiene and response procedures? Okay, so if there is a case of corona or another infectious disease on property, do you have a plan of action in place? Agreements, relationships assessed. Another important aspect is looking at your vendors and partners who are coming to your property. Have you got something in place where you're finding out if they are adhering to some kind of policy, such as the WHO's policy? And evaluate procedures formulated. So have you got a system for looking at your procedures as they evolve, as things evolve? And things are evolving. This is taken as of the 18th of May, updated map for us here in Europe. What locations, what countries have what guidelines with regards to what components of the travel industry are open. And that link is also in here, and I will make all of this available to Carl, this whole slides. But one thing that I think that you didn't perhaps know is that this entire set of steps are almost a one-to-one, identical, step-by-step guidance that we have been giving for data protection and privacy regulation compliance. It's just I've changed a couple of the words in each one. I think the approach that one takes to crises, there is a remarkable mirroring of them. And I guess, Eleanor Roosevelt said, with regards to crises, which, one of the things that she learned through life, the wisdom is knowing that this too will pass. I'm optimistic that this will pass for hospitality, hopefully sooner than later. I think the best thing we can do is learn from our challenges in the past and methodically step through these established steps to identify the solutions. And it's only by doing this can you really, only by knowing what your risks truly are, that you can make informed decisions. Otherwise, I think we'll find ourselves making huge investments in certain technologies that don't really provide us the value that we need, or huge investments in high-end consultations and other such things that are truly folly, and we don't have the luxury of burning cash right now. We need to be looking at what we can do with these methodical steps and map our processes. It's not a silver bullet technology. I think that'll come along, and I'm certainly reluctant to join in the enthusiasm for certain types of technologies that are going to perhaps compromise important other valuable things such as privacy. So that, getting back to the topic of contact tracing, I think there may be something there, but just jumping into that without taking a hard look at whether or not it's providing a true benefit, true value against the risks that it provides, the other liabilities that it provides. So, Carl, that's my prepared summary. I was hoping to be somewhere around 30 minutes, and I guess you all have
good.
Diligently been listening to me for 30 minutes. So, thoughts?
Great. Thank you very much, Daniel. Fascinating. We've got a number of questions popping up with slightly different varying angles on part of the same question relative between GDPR and this. Timo, would you like to ask your question out loud, so to speak?
Yeah, sure, I can do. Hi, Daniel. Good to see you.
Hey, Timo.
I give you an example on process which has to do with the contact tracing, like you just described. In Germany, we are opening up hotels again, which is good news. We do see business on the books, which is kind of low, but looking better than a few weeks ago. So, and one of the things we need to do as part of opening up the hotels, we need to do a registration of the guests who are with us, specifically for the health authorities to be able, if there is an outbreak, to trace who has been in contact with who. So, and of course, I wanted to use a digital process for that. So there are systems here. You scan a QR code, which brings you to a website. You enter your details, and then you have the list of all of the guests. So I got advised by our data processing officer that that we cannot do that because we cannot guarantee that we are in full control of the data the guest gives us, and we now are forced to implement a manual paper process. So that's a piece of paper. So the guest at check-in, he not only we need to familiarize him with the new hygienic standards and what he needs to do in the hotel, he needs to sign a piece of paper for the German registration stuff we do. Then he needs to do a separate paper for GDPR, so that he agrees that we can process his data. And then now we need another piece of paper for the tracing, which I think is just slowing us down. And my question around this is I need to be at the top of things. I need to work really fast. And at the moment, some of the GDPR legislations and the rules and regulations are indeed slowing me down. So my question is, in your opinion, do we need as an industry kind of a temporary relaxation of the rules and regulations to help us act faster and to change our business processes quicker to more contactless and more digitalization?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure. So, yeah, you know, and you didn't know that I was going to call you out as a member of that task force and had your name underlined. You know, from our conversations, I mean, early on, we were all wondering exactly what the legal basis, and I know Alvaro was on the call as well, and then, you know, the legal basis for processing data, you know, if it is being required by your by the government, there's your legal basis. Now, it seems to be that it's not so much GDPR, but it is the assurance of the security of the digital solution you were talking about, right? That seems to be at the crux of the challenge, right?
Correct, because at the end of the day, I need to protect my organization from potential fines and things that can happen to our owners. Yes, of course. Yeah.
So it's, you know, it's the assessment of that vendor or that system, right? Is it a third-party vendor that's providing it?
Yes, it is. Yes, it is.
So then if the government is requiring this and you're utilizing a third-party vendor because, you know, developing such software in an instance is not an option. It's a matter of making sure that data processing agreement is very clear, and the liability, so that you can, as the controller, you're very clearly identifying what the processing activity is that they're doing for you, which is best practice across any kind of data processing of personal data. What's really challenging now is that the personal data is sensitive and that it's health related. So
no, it's not. It's not health related. It is purely, when did you arrive? What's your name? What's your home address? What's your phone number? And when did you depart? There's no health information in it. It's only private address and private telephone number.
So you need to make that, you need to store that and make that available for the government.
For 14 days for the health authorities, if there was an outbreak, which can be linked to the hotel, that they want to know who was at the hotel at the very same time, so that they can contact those people, which of course is in the absence of a digital tracing app, which is only coming out in Germany in 2 weeks' time, I hear.
Yeah. So what is this third-party provider providing then, other than what's already
database?
In your database?
They provided a database which is hosted in Germany, but we don't have direct access to it. That's the whole thing.
Yeah.
So it's concerns around that. But let us step back from that specific example. So going back to the bigger picture. So again, we need to act. Or I think we really need to act fast with some of the things we're doing. And are the GDPR regulations, which are good and they're there for a reason, but they're at the moment kind of slowing me down in implementing more the contactless stuff we all really want in our hotels, or the guests want in our hotels.
That's right. I mean, that's the recent studies are that, you know, safety and hygiene will be you know, will surpass any other factor for the determination of whether or not to stay at a certain property. To me, the concerns around GDPR, you and I both know that at the center of the law is the idea of privacy by design. The fact that you're asking the question and looking at the solution saying, I don't know, are we protecting privacy, is an indication that it is first and foremost in your mind. And so to me, a legitimate interest assessment is in order. Completing that assessment, documenting, saying, we've looked into this, we know this is important, it is a requirement by the government of Germany, and we're utilizing this solution. We've outlined a data processing agreement for them to secure it, and we are trying to do our level best. To me, is the step forward, and then assessing as you continue. That would be my advice with this particular challenge. I'd be curious to hear if, you know, Alvaro, if you agree on that front with regards to.
He's just written something.
Oh yes.
I guess, guys, part of this question, I heard a very generic question the other day, which was, how does the whole recent rush to privacy conflict with the fact that we need to share a bunch of data to do with what Timo's talking about, tracing, and also health data? And the two seem to be actually diametrically opposed at a certain point. Rajesh, you've got a comment there. Do you want to maybe just share that? That it's more of a comment than a question, isn't it? But
yeah, it's not a question, but I was just going to say, I mean, I'm very involved, like I was with Daniel and Timo in the task force for GDPR. I'm currently very involved with another hat, which is getting involved in the PSD2 regulation, strong customer authentication legislation in the UK. I'm part of the hospitality special interest group that's working with the FCA. And I was just going to say, there has been, if we think that there is a requirement, and I'm kind of not sure that there is, because I think Daniel makes a good point that you know, that I think, you know, if the law trumps the GDPR legislation, I think that kind of has stood as a good basis upon which to follow the law rather than follow the GDPR regulation. So if they're in conflict, I think, you know, it's always been established, as far as I understand it, a reasonable establishment that if the law trumps it, i.e. you need to provide information about people's immigration status, that trumps their right to privacy about their immigration status, etc. But anyway, I mean, if we do feel that it's something, there is precedent, because the FCA have already, we've been lobbying the FCA, and we have got agreement from them, it's been published on their website, that they're going to delay the enforcement date of PSD2 from the already delayed March 2021 to now September 2021, giving everybody an extra 6 months on the basis that the world has stopped spinning for 6 months in the middle and getting it in preparation. And it's expected, although it's not been confirmed yet by the EBA or anybody else, that the other European competent authorities are going to follow suit. So, you know, there is a special pleading precedent already established with respect to you know, the impact of COVID on what would be considered otherwise appropriate and necessary legislation. So it isn't a question. I just think it's worth mentioning that there is precedent.
Absolutely. Daniel, we've got another question here. It's quite a, what's the word I'm looking for? Quite a straightforward question. You talked about don't focus on the solutions and everything else, but everywhere through your slides, you talk about documentation. Now, I'm assuming that you maybe don't mean, let me just check the question. You don't mean bits of paper, or do you mean bits of paper? Or how would you recommend that companies or hoteliers going through this process, maybe as Timo's just described, how do you recommend that documentation is maintained or planned in the first place?
Well, how do you plan on? What do you mean? How do you plan on the documentation?
Yeah, because you've got a lot of documents,
I mean,
a lot of processes. You know,
yeah.
is it? Do you just? I mean, I can ask the prosaic question. Do you just keep it in Word, or how should you keep it and attach
Maybe
it
I,
to the?
maybe I can answer that, how we did it on a practical level. So in the GDPR regulations, there are some things you need to document, which is the processes. And the German authorities, they give you kind of a form, and then you fill in that form, and it comes in a Word document, so you can alter it. And we have it available here as a PDF document, which is publicly available on the libraries we have here. And it's updated by our external data processing officer, a DPO, who is in charge of that. And every time we have a change in system, a change in process, like we have loads of those changes right now, then we need to go back and get it documented. What is the process and how is that working? So if we have a case of a breach, which we then need to report to the authorities, then we can show this is our process, this is how it was trained, here's our records, and this is how we plan to do it, and this is where we failed, or this is where the human has failed by clicking on a attachment in an email, as simple as that. So it is kind of in a format, in a Word format, but then it lives in a PDF document.
And are you aware if that's the same across Europe, Timo, other than just Germany? I mean, Rajesh.
And the GDPR stuff, it needs to be documented. The processes need to be documented, and you need to have the registration of the data you're processing. So I guess it's the same everywhere.
Okay, how interesting.
You can utilize a Word-based kind of just documenting it out and identifying who's responsible in with regards to your organizational planning logbook. You can utilize an Excel spreadsheet, similar to how a lot of organizations identified their processings for GDPR. What are you doing? Why are you doing it? Who's responsible for it? What are the areas? What is the you start quantifying? It would be a simple spreadsheet to build out how many touch points. What is the expected level of interaction with guests in this area? You can do that again, like in spreadsheets. You can utilize a process management software. There's no shortage of that as well. What are the business processes in there, and you can indicate those risks. If you want to do that there, that probably would be a little bit easier, because then you could also capture the various systems, whether they be high-tech systems, from the payment systems to kiosk touch point systems, to anything that's low tech, and all of that could be captured in that kind of management. But the mentality, and I guess that's kind of at the crux of what I was hoping to share today, is the mentality of thinking about understanding your overall business process and what people, systems, and risks according to that process are connected to that, and then by doing that activity, you can then eliminate any items that are of high risk. Then you can identify them and eliminate them. The concern, again, that I have and I've been seeing is the shiny object of some whiz-bang technology that's going to solve everything, without thinking about, well, what's the ramification of bringing in this new technology, or swapping out every kind of lock, or are we going to use keyless entry? We're going to change every doorway. Are we getting any kind of true reduction in risk by doing that, or is that just a distraction? Yeah.
Okay. One of the another question. Obviously, we have a number of people listening on our Hangouts today who are vendors, everything from PMS to EPOS to TV systems and the like, Daniel. But we also have hoteliers who maybe don't have a TMO who's knowledgeable as a technology expert to look at their procedures, their risk factors, and everything else. How do you think the vendor community can help hoteliers with this kind of process? Whether, for example, say you've mentioned door locks, maybe a hotel is looking at going to new electronic door locks. So could the vendor help them there? New TVs, can the vendor community help with this kind of process when talking to hoteliers who maybe aren't quite as expert as they may be?
Well, interestingly enough, I mean, these are the same activities that we're doing as an organization as well. And so I think it's a matter of scale, of course, but a lot of the challenges that we have, everyone's in the same storm, right? We're just have different boats. So I think for example, the policies around the guest or the journey at property, that should include guests, employees, and vendors. Vendors can very much be a partner in identifying that journey and mapping out those various instances, because as an employer, I have a very strong concern about having members of my team, and you're in data security space, so we have people that go on site a lot, and I'm very, I'm worried about them going on site as well. So we are, I think this is an interesting opportunity where we all need to be doing this mapping. So we need to look at what our teams are doing at property and make sure that it's not putting our people at risk, putting our customers' people at risk together.
Okay, great. We've got a question from Michael here. Michael, Michael Hayward, do you maybe want to ask your question?
Yeah, I was just wanting to know the extent to which you would recommend looking into the risks both to and from the immediate local community. And just to put some context around that, here in the UK, there's a lot of concern from domestic leisure destinations with this lovely warm weather that's arrived. There are these fantastic small communities that are now worried that all these Range Rovers from Chelsea will descend on them and bring the plague. So there's that kind of community worry there. You talk about staff, but there's that layer beyond. Can you tell me if I'm being making this too complicated from a risk mapping point of view, or if that is something you think we need to look at as well?
So one of the things we're looking at in our HTNG work group is thinking about the pre-arrival, and is that something that hoteliers cannot wrestle with because there's no control? I don't know about that. I don't know if I agree that they have no control or no say. In food and beverage here in the Netherlands, the anticipation is that in order to, here in 2 weeks, I guess, is when they're going to start opening dine-in seating, dine-in eating, or dine-in dining at restaurants. There has to be some kind of screening prior to. It's only by reservation, and there's some kind of screening process. So what is that? And what is the liability? What's the expectation of the restaurateur? I'm thinking about some of these small restaurateurs. They have to have some kind of sophisticated screening activity. And what about all that personal data? I think it's very much a reasonable question for hoteliers. You're spot on. The anticipation is that rubber wheel destinations will be the start of the recovery, where people can drive to these destinations. Hotels have opened here in the Netherlands already, and many of those drivable destinations have been highly booked, and it's it's looking like a strong spring coming out of this for them. But yeah, I think having some anticipation, setting guidelines, setting people's expectations is should be a very real part of your mapping, activity for a hotelier. Understanding where your guests are coming from and communicating to them what your expectations are of them. The trust between is going to be, that communication, I think is going to be essential.
Does that extend to the, you mentioned the WHO recommendation that we shouldn't have high-risk older individuals in high-risk roles. And I'm thinking about some of our staff that may be room attendants, and when they go home, they've got, living with the grandparents and all of that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So that's what I mean when I talk about a two-way risk mapping or concerns that I'm hearing about the risks. Is that something you would include into this as well?
Absolutely. And I think on one of the slides I indicated that, the segmentation of your staff, if those members are of high risk, or they have, that they have family members that are in a high risk area, it certainly complicates your, the employment, some of the employment aspects. And this then just exactly as Paul had, or Carl rather had indicated, that it is an intersection between privacy, because if you are asking you're making a determination of which members of your staff can be front desk because so-and-so may be a little bit older, or maybe that they're diabetic, or they have asthma or some other kind of something that puts them at greater risk, and then making a decision on their employment status. That you have to say, okay, I'm making a determination on that. I'm lowering my impact on this aspect, but will it increase my liability in another area? All the more reason to conduct your mapping activities. As soon as you throttle down less time with, for some people and throttle it up for others, you're making a decision.
Great. Daniel, thank you very much. As usual with our HFTP European Hangouts, I cannot believe an hour has disappeared right in front of our eyes. Daniel, thank you very much indeed. Absolutely fascinating, a very interesting presentation, and some great questions there.
Thank you.
We are done for today, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much. I'd just like to hand back to Selena, who will tell you a little bit more about next week and sign us off. Selena, over to you.
Yeah, great. Thanks so much, Daniel, and thanks everyone for joining today's Hangout. Before we close, remember that HFTP is hosting European Hangouts every Wednesday at 3 p.m. UK time. Join us next week, May 27th, with Carson Booth, discussing getting the best value out of your cloud services, SaaS, and SLA contracts. And also later today at 2 p.m. US Central Time, Hangouts offers a discussion on building customer confidence for the new normal with Greg Hopkins, Partner and Senior Managing Director at Provision Partners. Also, the Best of HFTP, including High Tech, Annual Convention and Club Forum is scheduled for October 26th through 29th in San Antonio, Texas. Thanks again to everyone for joining us today, and we hope to see you back here next week. This closes today's Hangout. Thanks, everyone, and goodbye.
Goodbye. Thank you,
Selena.
everyone.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Ciao, ciao.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.